Okay, in this lecture, we're going to be talking about light. So I wanted to read you a little introduction first. Light is a subtle element of design, but nonetheless a dramatic tool when used consciously. In three-dimensional design, light develops a range of values as it falls across a piece, creating highlights and shaded areas and shadows stretching beyond the work. These effects will vary considerably depending on the angle and intensity of the light source and whether the lighting is natural or artificial. The effects of light on a piece will also depend on its surface texture and the degree to which its surfaces curve away from the light. In addition to using the light cast upon a piece as a design element, artists may incorporate reflections into their work. Light itself may even be the medium with which the artist is working. So we kind of covered the highlights of what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, and that is value, and natural light, artificial light, reflection, and light as a medium. So those are sort of the four main ways that artists work with light. So let's tackle value first. And value, as anybody who's taken a drawing class or painting class, or photography for that matter, knows that that is that range of from white to black. Actually, I've got a value scale right here, right? Grayscale from white all the way to black. And this is something that we call middle gray, kind of that the dividing point between the lighter tones and the darker ones. So light reflected on a surface determines a color, and value, or the degrees of lightness and darkness, are the characteristics of color. So that's something to remember. So there's from white through gray to black, but each of the colors has a light color called a tint, all the way up through, by adding darkness to each of those tones, all the way up to a shade. So it goes from a tint through a shade within each tone. So let's take a look at how values play in a piece of sculpture. So this is a sculpture, a bronze sculpture of standing woman. And you can see that it goes from these bright highlights to, almost black, almost white to almost black. And in the variations show you that when there is a more rounded surface, you get more of these gradations of tone, right? On that gray scale, right? And that is something that we know tells us about the volume or the three-dimensionality of a piece when we look at it. So very gradual grays, that shows you these more rounded curves where it goes from, these highlights and then down to the black. This is more angular, like underneath the breasts here, from bright white almost to black. It's just more angular here. So that's how light helps us read the forms that we're looking at. So you can see the same on this one. The other cool thing that those shadows show us, like in this one, they can actually show us pattern, right? That kind of picks up and mimics what's going on in the greater surface. So we've got these elliptical shapes, elliptical shadows, these spheres, and then the ellipses take off on that. So this artist, Barbara Hepworth, is really working with all of that, the light and the shadows, to pick up and accentuate her forms. This is a really cool symmetrical piece of lighting with light in its core And this person, you know, not only did they know they had this really interesting, this is called the artichoke lamp. So you get this sense of these little panels, these layers, like an artichoke's leaves. But he knew that the way the light would go, you would also get these interesting patterns developed from really bright, 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 you know, white, 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 where the light is more direct, down to these almost blacks down here where there would be shading. Another thing to know here, just because we're looking at it, is that brown is actually a shade of yellow. So, all right, that's the artichoke lamp. Architects use lighting, of course, in so many different ways. And Frank Lloyd Wright, whose work was always seen as trying to relate with the natural environment. I mean, that's one of the things that he's most well known for. You can see how he used light here, not only in the light materials that he chose, but by the way light would reflect off of that and mimic these striations of stone, etc., and the waterfall, right? So you've got these light areas and then going back into dark recesses. Light areas going back into dark recesses. Other ways that he used materials, we've got this natural stone here. He would often even have the native stone around his site collected and mined and created to use that same stone in the building. So pretty interesting. And so on a bright day, this would really stand out as being bright, real shadows, bright, real shadows. On a more cloudy day, it's everything there is a little bit more subtle. This artist, Larry Bell, uses light to show us the overlapping. He's using plexiglass here, a tinted gray plexiglass. So where there's only one layer, you know, it's almost just transparent. And for each different layer that's behind it, you get these tones of grays. So he's really just working with values, and it looks like you can actually wander through this piece and really sort of know where you were going, perhaps by the intensity of the darkness there, but really just playing with values. Lighting and these values can really help us see the really interesting textures that artists use. So this is Giacometti on this monumental head. And because of the lighting on here, we're able to pick up that very aged and weathered look that the artist was trying to get on this face. All right, so let's move over into natural lighting. That we were looking at values. Now we're getting into natural lighting on this symmetrical piece here, right? So this is Andy Goldsworthy. This is called East Coast Sea Cairn. So not only does he deal with lighting in nature, right? He builds his piece. Oh, hold on, I've got my dog. How boring life would be without your pets, right? So Andy Goldsworthy is using lighting. This is a pretty simple form. As I said, it's very symmetrical. And he puts it out there. It's got light from the minute the sun comes up all the way through the night with starlight, etc. But you can see how the piece changes. Not only is he dealing with light here, sunlight, and the way it moves around and, you know, is higher in the sky and lower in the sky, and the way it hits it and creates these visual textures here. But he's also dealing with the tide, right? Here the tide's coming in. So later on in the day, this tide happens to come up and the light is very dim, or you've got starlight, and then you're dealing with a lot with these reflections. So, you know, he probably did a lot of studying to sort of figure out, well, one, when to just take these photographs, but, you know, really playing with light on his work. And anybody who works with public sculpture, if they're wise, are going to go out and do studies of what natural lighting, how that would affect their piece. Oops. All right, so this is another, you guys all recognize this. This is Abraham Lincoln's head in the Lincoln Memorial on the mall, the Capitol Mall. If any of you go to see it, it's pretty wonderful. But the sculptor was not real thrilled with the way the natural lighting kind of came in, which would be the way it looked here on the right. And so he had studies done because he really wanted the lighting changed in there so that it would have overhead lighting to really dramatize the face the way he wanted his sculpture to be seen. Okay, this is a very representational piece, you know, and not particularly abstract. You know, you've got even his, you know, warts or moles or and his wrinkles and kind of shaggy hair and everything, not real stripped down, economized to make him look like this real slick and smart lawyer, right? But the man that he was and all the weight of his decisions at a time in our country. So here it is with just front-on lighting, and you can see, I mean, it really helps for a sculptor to come in and see the details of the work, but it does not present itself as the dramatic piece that it can actually be. And here you see with this overhead lighting here, and you get these dark recesses, these heavy dark circles around his eyes and the shadows, etc., etc. It really gives you a very different feeling for the man. Okay, I just threw this in. This is somebody who, probably a photographer, but you guys might want to spend a few seconds looking at this on how lighting can change a subject, whether you're doing photography or in this case, whether you're setting up a sculpture. You know, how does it really change the look of the piece? I mean, this guy almost looks frightened compared to this guy looks a little bit, I don't know, nasty, really. Yeah, all of these mysterious. You can go through all the different ways it picks up on the shadows of the eyes, etc. So let's look at artificial lighting, okay? And this was sort of that introduction to artificial lighting, right? The sculptor can request to have lighting in a certain way if you have that much power for such an important piece. And here the artist can, you know, with lights, can change the whole feeling of a piece. So architects as well. So this is natural lighting during the day. I'm looking at the building now, and you see this white facade. It almost looks like a solid piece here with this kind of a symmetrical setting here. I also wanted you to notice the way they were using light as an introduction to this. When you go up the steps here, we see ballet, film, video, orchestra, performance, indie film, film interpretives, theater, cabaret, fashion, on and on. Really kind of interesting using light as an introduction to what you could see up here. Okay, so this is what it looks like during the day. You can see natural lighting in there, which is pretty inviting, that draws you in, that gold there. And at night, look at it's just almost a completely different thing. So instead of it being bright white, we've got the arches here, the facade here, being very dark. And the inside, which is at night when the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts is really, this is when all the main things, performances, etc., are happening. And you're just sucked into this place. Very inviting. Let alone that the fountain out in front is just this gurgling blast of white light here. And here again, clever photographer using reflective light here. I don't know whether this is after a shower or snow is melting or what's going on, but you get reflective light. So you can see how in the right hands, lighting can really make a piece very dramatic. Whoops. All right, Leonard Baskin made this piece. I think it's called Oppressed Man. So there's this owl here, often the symbol of wisdom or the goddess Athena, etc. And here's this man down here not looking all that great. But anyway, this is called Oppressed Man. You've got this big old fat owl up here sitting on his head. We can't, this is sort of terrible lighting at its worst. That's why I wanted you guys to look at that video in the beginning of the course on how to photograph your work. It can either look good or it can look kind of not so great, not its best, right? So there's not its greatest. This is a little bit better, right? We get a real sense now. We're seeing those values curve around here. We've got light coming from this way and light coming down from that way. So we're starting to pick up on these more dramatic depths in here. This is another piece of Baskin's work where, and he uses a lot of chisel. He works with wood and he works with stone. So he really likes the texture that the tools show. And you really get a sense now with good lighting, you can actually see all of his work here that there again adds to this sort of aged look and all that entails, right? Some sort of wisdom, sort of, just lines in all the ways we can read what line says to us. But here, really nice use of lighting for this piece. There's another one of his pieces just showing the rich texture with good lighting. And blah, again, with crummy lighting. The same piece. Okay, so more artificial light here. This is the Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the Vatican. And so, Michelangelo's a pretty famous guy. People want to come to see the Pietà. They want to see all his amazing work. This is one of his earlier pieces, actually. And with this really kind of intense lighting from all around, you see all of the detail of stone having the look of soft fabric, etc. The way her headpiece here frames her face and the shadow, how they pick the lighting to make her face show up, etc. here. And this is all great and good, but a lot of people decided that, there were a lot of different ways to see this work. And so they've started working with different lighting. And in fact, I think since about 2 years ago, now you can go in there, and I don't exactly know how it's done, whether it goes through a series of light changes, but there are 4 different ways that the lighting is projected on this piece for visitors to see and get different dramatic effects. I mean, are you a sculpture student going in there just to look at the way the carving was done? Are you a devout Catholic going in to get a sense of the whole drama of the time? Whatever your desire is here, and you can see it in different ways. So this is just a sample of one of those ways. You don't see every detail of the carving of her fabric, but maybe the more important thing for Michelangelo and the Vatican, one of the popes that asked him to make this piece, a little bit more dramatic, you know, her sense of loss, etc. Okay, so another way that people use light is reflected light, and we've seen over the weeks now different ways that artists use reflection, how kind of fun that can be. So this, when you get curved, flat, highly polished surfaces, they reflect light. When they're curved, they kind of distort light. So here again, as people are walking by, it's like walking into a fun house, right? I don't know if you guys go to carnivals and walk into fun houses where they have curved mirrors and you can see yourself looking like a pear or looking like, you know, your head was exploding or whatever. So just remember that roughened, dull surfaces absorb light and highly polished surfaces reflect light. So interesting to have a little bit of both even. So this is a very cool chair. It's called Big Easy Volume 2 by Ron Arad. And now I'm just going to show you a couple pieces here. This is a Henry Moore piece, also at the Lincoln Center, a reclining figure in this reflecting pool. This one's in early evening. I'm just going to show you here so you can see the different way that light works on a piece. At this point, though, we're also looking at how he is using reflections of his piece off of this reflecting pool. And when it's very still, you can get very crisp reflections, making a symmetrical vision of this. It also, if you'll notice as it goes through, it almost looks like the piece is floating in air, kind of. Here's the back of the piece. Look at how cool it is, though, the way you see this reflection and then this crispness where the water just stops. I mean, it just really makes a sculpture within a sculpture within a sculpture. Okay, here's some more ways that people use reflection, reflected light. This is Francisco Infante, and he has these mirrors, broken mirrors, suspended in space, but at different angles. And if you studied this would be really cool to come upon on a hillside here. This mirror is kind of reflecting upwards. And so you're seeing reflections of the treetops, these lines. This is a very linear piece, right? So you're seeing the lines here up in the sky reflected back at you. And over here, you can, if you were coming up, you would see a picture of the snow of the ground and the bases of those trees reflected up into the sky. So it's really pretty interesting. People just having fun with phenomena, etc. Here's another one of his pieces. And you can see just how on a hillside here at dusk, how each one of these mirrors is picking up because of the height. This one's getting more light. And as you go down, you see less of the skyline there. Just a pretty interesting way to look at that phenomena. Here's another one of his pieces. So reflecting down into the dirt, and you get this weird, jagged, mountainous sort of look up against the sky. This one down here, we've got the sky embedded right into that pile of sand. So let's talk a little bit about light as a medium, as light as the material itself. And you've seen the interior of this before. When we were looking at space and interior and exterior space and negative space and positive space. Well, here he is using light. I mean, this whole wall is pretty interesting, and these little sculptural volumes here that he's using. But the light here is a thing that's just the stark brilliance reflecting in. And it makes you think there's a little bit of color here, but that's how in churches, for example, they use stained glass windows that would just be glowing with these images of holy stories and personages. So using light there, just natural light coming through tinted glass. And here an artist is using neon light. Now, you know, there's all kinds of lighting. Lasers can be beamed out into space in thin lines, right? In a straight beam right up into the sky. When you're using things like fluorescence and neons, they're a little bit on the fragile side, so you often have to have some kind of a structure with them. In this case, this person just used the corner of this building here to play with light. It's very linear and geometric form. Here's another way. This artist is using flexible steel rods coming out of these bases, and the lighting is coming up from the base. The base itself is lit, but there's also these lights below that are pointing up, and then you get this wonderful calligraphic line zooming around into space. It almost looks like if you were out on the 4th of July with a sparkler or something, like whipping it around, right? Spelling words and things you used to do or still do. Here's somebody using light in an installation piece where they're creating this environment. You walk up through the stairs. There are colored gel lights behind these, and this is some sort of plastic held together with just, you know, black electrical tape here. Kind of here again, a very geometric piece, asymmetrical, right? And you walk up and you're sort of enveloped in these glowing colored lights. And you've seen this before. James Turrell does these skyscapes where there's these domes. Let's get a picture here. You can see the sky up through here and the light reflecting up on the wall. But here's what it would look like on the inside. You usually walk around these things. And so this is sort of a maze aisle back here. And you enter, you sit down, and then you just watch the light move, you know, all around the space here. Sometimes, at certain times of the year, it's directly above and joins up with this patterned stone down below that sort of looks like a planet down there. And this kind of looks like a planet up here, but this is actually this dominant and focal point up here, the dominant thing here. The whole, the sky, is a thing that almost looks like a solid thing, right, out there in space. So there again, really playing with the phenomena of light. Looking at the piece this way, very symmetrical. Emphasis here on the light, the circle and the movement of the circle, motion. So another very obvious way that people use light is in theater lighting, right? I mean, look at this thing, this stage setting here, right? How dramatic the light just picks up everything dark, but then having these white structures around here, you get a sense of a real building when all it is just beams, right? And the other cool thing is that lighting can be used in a very quick way, like the actors can move very quickly. Stage settings, you know, you kind of have to turn off the lights or whatever, move the sets out to make a different scene. But with lighting, you know, they could turn all of this off and just have the lights just directly down on these guys, or over here on these portraits of maybe these deceased persons over here, or presidents, or whomever they are. But, you know, using lighting, it can be a very quick way to get an immediate dramatic change. Here's another one. So here she is in a clawfoot tub, looking like she's emanating light, getting power from above, spiritual light or whatever, and she is giving power and light and spirit backward, back up and out. Sort of interesting juxtaposition here with the bathtub, but with that glowing edge right there with that white. Look at the values, the way they're playing with values in this piece. But in a second, you know, those lights could be cut and she would disappear. I wanted to show you just at the end here, just some ways that some people use lighting. This is a group of artists, I think they're British. I can't remember their names now, but they create these wonderful found objects and scrap metal sculptures and have one direct light come at them. And they are really playing with the shadows that they can create, which is pretty wonderful. I love even the way that the light kind of radiates out from the center here. It sort of undulates in these values up here. Okay, the dominant thing isn't really the sculpture. Well, it sort of depends on your point of view, but it's all about the shadow, right? And here's a couple others, and you can see how they've set this up. This would be a really fun thing to do. Maybe it'll show up on one of your short hops. Nothing as dramatic as this, but just doing something kind of fun on a blank wall. And here, just how we can appreciate the texture by the lighting, right? And because these are just painted black found objects in this relief, this bas-relief piece here. So you can just see the tonality that comes, the values with the highlights, wherever the light hits, going into these very dark black areas. And even in just a regular museum, you get the drama of a piece like this. This is the goddess of earth and death. I think this is a Maya piece. But you see all this incredible texture, and there's skulls and things like that. Anyway, the lighting really can make it so much more effective. So anyway, lighting, so important. Definitely do not, you can use lighting on its own, natural lighting, artificial lighting, just having those values show us the three-dimensionality of a piece, or using lighting as its own medium.